just before we start the show, I want to take an opportunity to invite you to join me for the Podfluence Weekly newsletter, which is available both on LinkedIn and through the official newsletter channel. Now, if you are on LinkedIn and it's easier for you to follow there, then please just click on the link in the show notes, which will take you straight to Podfluence on LinkedIn, where you can subscribe for free and get weekly updates on Podfluence articles as well as episodes. If you would like to subscribe to the full newsletter where you'll get additional materials and, as my little incentive to you, my pre-podcast guest checklist for you to use when you're appearing on podcast shows so that you can be fully prepared every single time, then please click the link to the official newsletter in the show notes. Hope to see you there. Let's get on with the show. Have you ever experienced less than ideal professional culture or wondered how you could be showing up as a more effective leader? Maybe you've had the experience of an amazing working culture and would even like to know how you can help to create them for yourself. This is Podfluence, the show that helps you grow your influence and income with podcasts. My name is John Ball, and my mission is to help you, the self-employed business coach, to grow your influence and income now so that you can have a continuously thriving coaching business. That said, if you are a service-based solopreneur, this content can undoubtedly help you too. A quick message about this particular episode. I realized recently that I had a bunch of episodes that I recorded before I took a hiatus from the show, before I took a full-time job on last year, and before I rebranded and repurposed the podcast into Podfluence. Some of them are somewhat still related to the topic, like today's, where really it's a coaching and kind of leadership topic. Some of them are a bit less so, but they're still interesting discussions on topics like negotiation skills and nootropics. I think you're going to still want to hear them. So my plan is to bring them to you as bonus episodes. It's going to take a while to get them because I want to bring you the most relevant content, the stuff that really is going to give you the biggest bang for your buck in terms of growing your influence, your impact, and your income as quickly as possible. I think you're going to get a lot of value from this episode, and I hope you'll enjoy it. My guest on this episode is Tracy Tutty. Tracy is a herbalist, an accountant and performance coach based in New Zealand, who I was privileged to be able to serve in a coaching capacity for several years. And I got super excited when I saw that Tracy was on LinkedIn talking about influence and persuasion, which was when I reached out to her to chat and see if there was an episode there for us to put together, which there was. So in this episode, Tracy helps to answer what does it take to create psychological safety in a work environment and a positive, non-toxic working culture. And how can we, as leaders, be more ethically and effectively influential and persuasive? If you have your device in your hand right now, then do me a quick favor and click the plus sign on Apple Podcasts or Spotify at the top of the screen, or whatever you have to subscribe on your preferred listening platform so that you can get weekly updates of Podfluence as they drop. So pop in your earpods and let's get things started.
Welcome to Podfluence, the podcast for business coaches and professional speakers who want to build audience and authority through podcasts. Here's your host, international coach and speaker, John Ball.
Welcome to Podfluence. I am really happy to be speaking to someone who I've worked with before in the past, and we thankfully have stayed in touch. And the tables are turning a bit now from me being the consultant to her being the consultant. And so welcome to the show, Tracy Tutty.
Thanks, Johnny. It's a pleasure to be back with you.
Great. It's a real delight to speak to you, and I really enjoyed working with you before, and I'm certainly very glad that we've kept in some level of contact, even if it is just the odd LinkedIn posts and stuff. But one thing that I particularly wanted to get in touch with you is because you were posting some stuff on LinkedIn about influence and persuasion. I thought, I need to speak to Tracy about that, and we ended up having a bit of a deeper chat about it. And so we're going to be talking about influence and persuasion as a service, and I'm really looking forward to having that conversation with you. So let's get into talking about why we are talking about influence and persuasion as a service. Where does that start for you?
For me, it stems from the fact that, and I think we really come close to understanding this even more over the last couple of years, that one of the things that we as people, as humanity, we really need to feel that connection. And connection is about feeling seen, it's about feeling heard, and it's about feeling understood. And for me, influence and persuasion comes from that act of service, that act of I see you, I hear you, I'm really doing my best to understand where you're coming from. And so that's the way that I think of influence and persuasion.
And you've been relating that specifically to service-based businesses. Like you mentioned to me that you have had a coaching program where you talk about this. Tell us a little bit more about that.
Sure. So I have this coaching program. It's called the Corporate Sage Effect. It brings through my background as a medical herbalist. I'm also, a chartered accountant, I must confess, and also lead a lot of teams as well. And so what the Corporate Sage Effect does is it works with drained managers and it supports them in becoming that corporate magician. You know, that person you see at work and you're like, how does she do it? How does she get it all done? How does she look like she's having a good time? And how is she helping her team to be so effective? And one of the things that we talk about, of course, is in addition to having the toolkit to be a great manager, you also need to be working with your body and taking care of yourself, because managing teams is an Olympic sport.
It certainly is. So take us through some of the elements. It's like, what is it that most people don't really know in service-based businesses about influence and persuasion, or maybe just getting wrong?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing that we're missing, or the thing that I'm seeing the most that is the biggest contributor to drain managers, is making it okay to take care of ourselves, making sure that we have the energy to be there for our team, making sure that we have the energy to be listening, to be noticing those cues, not just in our own teams, but across teams within the organization as well. And I think, that ability to take care of ourselves first and to feel good about that, it's something that really contributes even more to an organization. Because if you have a whole lot of high functioning, high energized, relaxed, calm, happy people, you're going to have a productive organization.
Yeah. And we know that burnout is a big issue for people, right? And is an increasingly common issue that probably isn't being tackled anywhere near as effectively as it could be or should be.
That's right. And one of the sad things is that a lot of the people that I'm working with, they're coming to me because they don't want their managers to know. And it's part of that change that we really need to see in this world, where it's okay to put your hand up and say, hey, I need some help, and to not have that count against you.
Yeah, this is, I think, often one of the biggest issues we have in life. And it is certainly something that I see as a blockage to influence and persuasion in general, because it takes people out of being able to be their authentic selves and trying to be something that maybe they're not, but maybe nobody can be. And I don't know if you maybe have had a similar experience to me, and this is something I often refer to on my show, but when I very first got into the world of personal development, there were quite a lot of people around who seemed to be teaching that you had to effectively become a type A personality, an overachiever. You had to become a complete go-getter, getting up at 4:30 every morning and then going and doing your 2-hour morning routine. And that's how champions start the day. And there are still people teaching that. But I also know many successful people who do none of that. And so it's like, okay, is that really essential? If you are not this sort of champion person having your feedback for breakfast and doing all this stuff, can you still be successful? The answer is yes. That it's interesting that we tend to think, well, you're supposed to at least show up as that. And I think especially in the corporate world, there is this role of how we're supposed to see people, or how are we supposed to project an image that is supposed to be a strong leader that has no chinks in their armor and it was completely invulnerable. And that is damaging.
Yeah, you're so right. And there's also that aspect about, work life and home life and work-life balance, where this presupposition is that home doesn't affect work and work doesn't affect home, and that you have these two distinct lives. It's almost like you have two distinct identities, which, as you say, is stopping you from being your truly authentic self. And it's not about a work life and a home life. It's about a life. And it's about how we find that balance as well.
Do you think that over the couple of years that we've just had with COVID and everything like that, that a lot of people or more people have woken up to this?
I think so. And I think in the beginning it was difficult because we were still trying to be our old corporate selves at home. And then something magical happened where it became okay to have the kids peering over your shoulder when you're in that meeting, or the cat walking across the screen, or the dog coming into the room, and we became more human. And so it's been a really tough couple of years, especially with the amount of home working if your home's not set up for it. But I think also it's helping to peel back those layers and to help us discover who we really are, and also to get to know the people that we work with on a more human basis.
Yeah, who doesn't want to be seen as more human? And I often think there's always danger in this sort of how we are perceived and how we are perceiving other people, and our perceptions tend to be very one or two dimensional. We see a thin slice of a person if we think we see a whole person, but we make a lot of assumptions based on that. We basically make our whole judgment of who that person is, and yet we see a very smaller part of who they are. We don't really know. And so there's all assumption going on. And there's an element as well to which you are leading or triggering those assumptions, often in professional environments, to get people to think certain ways. And I can see why this is potentially unhealthy for people. But I'm wondering what difference we need to make and how we start making that difference.
Yeah, it's such a good question, is it? I think fundamentally it comes from that act of courage that comes from showing who we really are. Because like you say, we're presenting these images of who we think we should be. And on the other side, we're receiving those images of who we think they think we should be. But actually it's more a reflection of who we think we are based on what we're judging about the other person. And so I think really the first step is understanding that it actually takes a lot of energy to carry that persona. And even though letting go of that armor might be a scary thought or, that act of courage, that first small step, if you get to the place where you trust yourself enough to be you, it actually takes a whole lot less energy to be yourself at work than to pretend to be the person you think you're supposed to be.
It's fascinating to me that I've learned, because I read a lot of psychology and articles and I spend a lot of time studying this, that people going for interviews for professional jobs, it's actually beneficial to, when somebody asks you those horrible interview questions like, what's your biggest weakness or something like that, to actually give something that is a weakness, not something that is catastrophic perhaps, but something that is a genuine weakness, or admit or own up to a mistake, or show how you've learned from that, because it makes you seem more real, but also it gives that element of self-awareness that you actually know yourself and you recognize, I'm not perfect, because this sort of thing of what's your greatest weakness? Oh, I'm a perfectionist. It's like it's those sort. Those sort of stock answers that people give, they don't tell you anything. They just tell you, I've been prepping for this interview and I'm not going to show you who I really am. And I got asked in an interview situation not that long ago, what if I didn't get a role, what did I think would be my reason for not getting it? And in one sense, I thought it was a horrible question, because it's like it was like a group interview kind of situation, and I didn't want to give an honest answer to the group. But because I sort of think, it's not that I don't have self-awareness, but the reasons why I don't think I would get this job are not something I want to share with a whole group of people who I don't know. So I felt very, very unfair in that situation, but I wasn't willing to let myself be vulnerable even for that position. So I see even then, I held back. I perhaps protected myself from what a whole bunch of people who don't know me and never will know me might think about me. And maybe that was something that showed that I didn't, or maybe didn't have that self-awareness, but perhaps I do. I just didn't want to really be that vulnerable in front of that group of people. So it's interesting how much we will or won't allow ourselves to be vulnerable in certain situations, because I could see in a one-to-one situation, I would have answered that question probably quite honestly, sort of if I felt safe to answer it. But we do have to feel safe to be ourselves. in these environments to allow that vulnerability. And so there has to be a culture of safety. And maybe a big part of the problem is there isn't that culture of feeling safe to be vulnerable.
I think you're so right. And I love that, because when you're in a room with strangers, you don't have that, at the risk of overusing that sort of undercover hippie word, you don't have that circle of trust. And so, we go into that defensive role, which is something that not only is quite a natural, understandable thing to do, but it's something that we're also taught to do. And it's interesting because, like you say, if it was a one-to-one situation, you probably would have answered differently. And it's, like when I think about the people that I've hired when I've been the hiring manager, when I'm asking questions like that, it's funny because as the candidate, you're like, oh, I only want to show this amount of vulnerability. I don't want to show that part of myself. But actually, as an interviewer, you can see it in the body language. And what you're looking for is that agile person who has that emotional intelligence, who has that self-awareness, who has that ability to learn. It's those things that we don't want to show that the hiring person is actually looking for most, and what's going to make you stand out in the interview as well.
Yeah. I think this could easily be a whole rabbit hole to dive into, but I want to get to some other elements with you, Tracy, because I've talked a lot on my show. I'm going to be coming up to 150 episodes soon. There's a lot. There's a lot of talk that's been happening here. But I've talked a lot on my show about influence and persuasion as an individual, and we're going to talk about influence and persuasion as a service. I want to bring us back to that and why that's so important.
Yeah, it comes back to connection. It comes back to that fundamental need that we have as a person to be seen, to be heard, and to be understood. So, when you're in an environment where you need to persuade someone, it's not about putting yourself in a position where it's like, okay, here's my checklist. I need to persuade this person now. The fact is that if you've been serving that person, if you've been listening to them, if you've been seeing them, if you've been attempting to understand them, you're already able to influence them. And you're already providing that service because they're feeling heard, they're feeling seen, they're feeling understood. And so they feel validated as a person. And so there's that natural camaraderie between you, and you naturally want to help each other out. And so it makes that persuasion model so much more honest and authentic, because it's about, I understand what's going on in your world, and you understand what's going on in my world. And there's this thing that I think that we could work on together, and I know how it could benefit me, and I understand how it could benefit you, because you put that groundwork in. People see everything. Influence isn't something that just happens on a Monday or a Friday. It's like all day, every day.
Yeah, and I think that's easily forgotten in our professional lives. It's like we are a whole person, and how we show up or how we act, how we interact. In fact, I'm actually listening to an audiobook at the moment that's all about body language. It's an interesting subject. It's a series of books that I've decided to study and listen to about body language and understanding it.
Nice.
And it's fascinating. It's eye-opening. It's fascinating. It's nothing that's saying, oh, if somebody does this, that means that. It's like, it could mean that. And it sort of shows you what to look for and signs and context and all these things that you have to put together. And I've had some body language experts on the show before, which is, it's a super interesting area. But certainly understanding how we put each other at ease, or how we create those relationships and allow people to feel trusted. And there are things that we do consciously in order to do that, and there are things that we do unconsciously, but it's all communication, and it's all happening all the time. And so we need to ideally understand that so that we can make sure we are communicating more effectively. But I'm getting sort of taken back to not just my chat with Mark Bowden, he's a body language expert, which was incredibly enlightening, but also my chat with a lady called Natalie Clune, where we talked about relationship marketing, because a lot of similar themes came up there with that in terms of understanding each other, being seen. What are the things that you feel that business owners need to be thinking about and doing to create that kind of emotion and environment and trust?
I think if you're looking at it from the perspective of I'm an employer and I have employees, I think one of the most valuable things you can do is get to know what your employees value, what matters to them, why are they there, and what's the deeper purpose behind what they're doing. Because we could be doing any job, and as long as it fulfills 2 to 3 of our values, we feel content. And if we feel content, we want to give more to the organisation. We want to see that organisation succeed because it's meeting a deeper need within ourselves. And so by doing that, what you're helping the organisation to do is, well, first of all, you're reducing staff attrition. You're improving the health and well-being of your staff by helping them to feel cared for and helping them to feel that what they do on a daily basis matters, which has a huge impact, not just on their mental health, but also on their immunity. And then you're also taking that a little bit broader, where you're encouraging your employees to see your customers in the same way. So if your customers can understand that the organisation sees what matters most to them, not just to make a sale, but from a genuine perspective of service and caring, it makes a huge difference to the life of that organisation. And so the organisation's not only contributing to the customers, but it's also helping their employees to feel fulfilled within their work.
That's interesting. I mean, from even from a business owner perspective, as someone who has worked for myself for quite a long time now, I think very few people consider their own values and fulfillment, because they often will get focused on this. It's all about making money. And like, okay, some people that is a top value, right? But, and it's certainly an important thing in business that you shouldn't forget about. You're not going to last long in business if you're not making any money. yeah, it should be somewhere up there, but it's probably not the most important thing. And so people aren't always operating from their own values. And I think that's often why people don't feel very fulfilled in their work or in their business, because they're not actually thinking about what's going to be fulfilling to them. And they're thinking about what's going to put food on the table and what's going to set them up for a nice retirement and things like that. There's nothing wrong with thinking those things. But, you know, if fulfillment is something that's important to you, that's only going to get you so far. You need to go deeper into these values that we're talking about. How do we do that? How do we find out and know if we're actually living or working within our values?
It comes from self-awareness, and it's part of a manager's job as well, in terms of serving their team, to help their team uncover their values if that's what they want. I mean, not everybody wants to go down this path, and that's okay. But by working with your team, so working with a staff member who reports to you, for example, as part of the much dreaded 6 monthly performance review, it's not just about how you're performing at work. It's about what your personal goals are. It's about unpacking what matters most to you that year and finding ways to support that person. You can also pick it up in the language that they use. So, for example, if they're like often coming up with amazing spontaneous ideas, for example, you can test that out. Maybe creativity is an important part of their life. Is there somewhere in their role where they could champion some change within the organisation? Or if connection is really important to them, as well as doing the role that they're doing, could they be helping on the social club committee, for example? So it's about understanding those things that they talk about, that not just the activities that they're sharing, you know, what they did on the weekend, but also the way that they're talking about things can help you understand whether this person has a high degree for certainty or this person has a high degree for innovation. The way that they talk about it and the things that they're saying will leave clues. And it's the manager's responsibility to pick up those clues and to help them to fashion a way of completing their role in a way that also fulfills those values.
Yeah. I've heard from a number of people who do hiring positions, like one of the things that primarily people will hire for, especially those who have a sort of community in their business, is fit. You have to be able to fit into the community. So I guess you have to at least be exploring or having a good sense of what somebody's values are to be able to know whether they would fit or not. But what if, and I don't know if this is something that could or would happen, you start to dive into somebody's values or get a sense of that, and they don't really fit with the general values or the company values or the culture.
Yeah, it's interesting that, isn't it? I think if you're delving into that, you probably already know. there's probably already clues that they're not entirely comfortable in the environment or they're not happy within the role. And then it can be just a matter of helping them to unpick those values, because sometimes it can be the result of our upbringing, that nature versus nurture, or is it both? And so people aren't aware of a particular value, but deep down subconsciously, there may be a yearning to learn more about that value, which is why they are attracted to your organization. So just because you're uncovering somebody who has values where you think, oh, hang on, this doesn't quite work, doesn't necessarily mean that there isn't something going on subconsciously that you can help them to bring to the surface.
Right. So people's values are not set in stone. They can change. They can evolve and adapt.
They can evolve and adapt, for sure.
How important is it in terms of results to be focused on the influence and persuasion that we talk about as a service? Like in terms of the difference it makes to the company, in terms of the difference it makes with sales and customer relationships and those kinds of things.
So in terms of influence, if our basic premise is the fact that we're seeking to understand somebody, so when we're making a sales call, we're seeking to understand them, not just to sell them a widget. Or when we're reaching out to the marketing team, we already have a relationship with them and we can be like, oh, Mary seems a bit down today. What can I do to support her? All of those things are coming together to make an organization firstly more agile, but also more has a greater ability to respond to what they're bringing in through their customers. Because when you have a sales team who is in tune with the customer to the extent that they understand their values and they understand what matters to them, you get more innovation in terms of your product roadmap, but you also get that greater sense of loyalty and brand evangelization between the customer and the organization as well. So it can have a huge impact, not just on like the financial bottom line, but also, what we talked about earlier in terms of improving our staff's health and well-being through their immunity and mental health, and just generally feeling supported and helping them to feel more loyal and to feel proud of where they're working.
Yeah, I've seen some interesting. There's a guy, I think his name's Dan Price, and he's a CEO of a company in the US. I don't know if you've ever heard of him, but I see a lot of what he posts on Twitter. And one of the things I really like about him is that he talks about fairness in the business and not having these ridiculous CEO salaries, and making sure that everyone is actually getting well paid, that there shouldn't be this huge disparity that we now have between people at the lower end roles of the business, the people who are at the top, because it's utterly crazy that so much company money has to go into doing that. And I see that those values, he expresses those values a lot. He also does a good job of highlighting where other people are really just running on corporate greed, or trying to screw over their workforce because they're not, they just want to get more money out of them. And it's important to have those voices, and sadly they're still few and far between. But what you see is when somebody like him opens up jobs in their business, they get overwhelmed with applications because people want to work for a company that's actually going to value them and pay them fairly and has these really strong values. And I think we see that a lot, that people do talk about businesses and companies that have these strong values that they like, just as much as we talk about the ones that have the opposite. People really want to see that kind of change. They want to see more corporate caring, less of this sort of cold, almost sociopathic nature of business, where emotions get pushed aside for the bottom line. And it's all about how much money can we make for our shareholders, which we still see is the prevalent kind of business attitude. But we do see the shoots of change, at least, or we see some pushback against that. But it's interesting to see those values and contrast them, and how attractive that is, because I think many people don't feel recognized or rewarded or seen or valued in the roles or businesses that they work in. I think this is a bigger issue, not a bigger issue, but it's a different issue for people who are self-employed, who don't have anyone other than their customers perhaps, to help them feel valued. They have to do a lot of self-validation work. But the validation stuff, the recognition and reward stuff is really important. Right?
And it's really interesting because there's a lot of research coming out at the moment. Well, it has been coming out for a little while now around the millennial workforce and the fact that they have different expectations about their work and that they're looking for places where they can experience their values, they feel validated, they feel looked after, they feel cared for. Whereas the different workforces that have come before, that hasn't necessarily been to the fore, not because it didn't matter to them, but because they didn't know that they were allowed to ask for it.
Yeah, it's been interesting to me because I maybe see another side to that, which is having worked with as clients a lot of business owners who have been hiring millennials in, and many of them will say the same things of they have a struggle in actually getting people to work. And I don't know if this is a millennial thing. I just know it's a common issue that has been coming up, and that theme seems to come across as well. And maybe that is an incentivization thing. Maybe it is a values thing. But actually having people come in and almost feeling like they're doing you a favor by being there. There's a lot of that attitude around now. And I wonder, maybe it's not really sort of along the path of what we're talking about, but I wonder if you have any thoughts on that.
I think it's really difficult, isn't it? Because we're looking at a real step change in relation to, that sense of entitlement that a lot of the research is reporting back in relation to the millennial workforce. And I think part of the challenge is that the older workforce doesn't really know how to deal with it. And I think it's also a sign of our times, where things are moving quickly, things are much more instantaneous. Whereas before, when you went to work, you started at the bottom, sweeping the floor, and then you worked your way up and you were patient and you did your time and eventually you got there. Whereas now, when we're looking at a lot of our businesses are information-based and they're relying on these people having this expertise, there isn't that same sense of regulation that there was before. And so you get that disconnect between the two parts of the workforce where one is coming in and saying, well, I know all this stuff, and not really acknowledging that there's a whole lot of other stuff that they haven't yet experienced. And then, there's the other part of the workforce that's saying, well, you have to do your time because I had to do my time. I think it's really challenging.
Yeah, it definitely is. And I don't know, I don't have the answer for that, but I do think we can work more. I think ultimately we have to work together to try and figure out what the solution is, right? Work with the younger generation who are coming into business and find the ways that work to actually communicate and to motivate and infuse them. And maybe that is more about speaking to their values than saying, hey, I'm paying you a salary, you're supposed to do this, this, and this. It might mean having to have a bit more of an emotional connection with your employees, and perhaps there's people who are resistant to that. I don't know what the solution is. I'd be interested to hear from anyone who does have thoughts and maybe even some solutions and plans that have been working for them because it seems to be a fairly common issue.
Yes.
I want to come, swing us back to more corporate values. I know that from having done a bit of consulting work in the past, a lot of companies will bring in performance consultants and they'll just get this whole, and then maybe have you there for a few days or a week or a couple of weeks, and they just want all these recommendations. They'll stick up a plaque that says these are our values, and that's it. That's our values. They're up on the wall. You know what they are now. And they're not actually doing anything with that other than saying, hey, look, we've got this nice shiny plaque that says what our values are, can point to that and tell you. But if you actually look around at the culture or the actions of the business, you won't see those values represented anywhere. I think that is a big challenge for people these days of just one thing to state values, but another thing to actually live them. Is that something that you've seen as well?
Yeah, I have. And I've been a while back, like I'm talking probably 10, 15 years ago. I was in an organization where, the consultants came in and they got all the brand colors and they pasted up the values on the wall of the meeting rooms, and you'd go into a meeting and it would still be people shouting at each other. And I think one of the values at the top was something about integrity or compassion or something like that. And these meetings would be the absolute opposite of it. And again, it's about reaching back to what we talked about in the beginning around authenticity and honesty. And I think, the times have gone where you can paste the values on the wall and behave in a different way. The technology is there so that people can be more honest about it and be more vocal about it. And I also think that, the workforce is demanding that we have that integrity as well. I think that sort of thing, it comes from the top. What needed to happen in that meeting was for the manager who was leading that meeting to say, this behaviour is not okay. And I'm hopeful that we see more of that as time goes on. It's certainly improved over the last 15 years, but I think in a number of organisations, it still has quite a way to go.
Yeah, I used to work for the airlines years ago, even before we ever worked together. And in that time, I was very aware, because every year we had to do this, that in our what they call annual checks, when you had to be relicensed on different aircraft, there would also be this element of what they called CRM, crew resource management. I know CRM stands for different things in different, but in the airlines it is crew resource management. And what that was about having better communication between crew and pilots, because traditionally there had been this whole thing of almost like the captain was like God. What the captain says goes. You don't contradict the captain. And there was certainly, I encountered captains who were like that. But what they found was that whole, I guess much like surgeons in hospitals, that whole culture was responsible for a lot of accidents, because people were afraid to speak up if it contradicted the captain, or people were afraid to report something and would keep their mouth shut for fear of being thought stupid or shouted at by the captain or the surgeon or whatever. Those sorts of seniority-based sort of positions where seniority has the final say, and that's it. Whereas what the airlines have been working on, because it has led to catastrophes, plane crashes, so they had to do it, was having a place of communication where the people at the top of the chain had to listen to the people further down the chain, and that any valid concern should be expressed and fed back, and that there wouldn't be any negativity to come back. Or if there was like intimidation or bullying or anything like that there was also a management culture that would deal with that. Now, I couldn't speak to how effective all of that is in terms of, does it stop it altogether? Probably not, but it certainly has educated people and reduced that and created more of a culture of communication. And yet the business world is still catching up on a lot of this. And you wonder how many business catastrophes are caused because people won't listen to the voices further down, or they think they know better. And yet inevitably, on the climb up to the top, you lose touch with a lot of what's going on in the day-to-day, and how people really are, or what really is the state or nature of business. As you work your way up, you get more isolated. I mean, that's inevitable. And so it's finding those ways to make sure that, maybe not just make sure that you don't get so isolated, but to make sure that people's voices are being listened to, and that people are valued and heard, and that if there is something that's being fed back, that it doesn't get shouted down, that it doesn't get bullied away, it doesn't get ignored for the sake of somebody else's ego, or well, I guess it is generally for ego, right?
It's about introducing the possibility of consequences, isn't it? And I think, in the past, there's perhaps not been the consequence of shouting down somebody who has a good idea.
Yeah, it could be a lot of that. When it comes to how businesses are being seen, are there businesses or corporations that you think are a good example of how to do it right?
I think when I look back on, because I've worked for a variety of organisations, because I work as a consultant. And so when I look back on it, it's kind of like a patchwork, because there are particular things that particular organisations did really well, that if you brought them all together, it would be a great organisation. Like I think about early on in my career, the CEO who used to walk the floor every morning knew everybody's name, he knew their family, he knew what was going on, he knew everything that was going on in that organisation. And I think of a different CEO who forsake his corner office with the amazing view so that he could sit in the middle of an open plan office, simply so that he could be approachable, and again, so that he had an understanding of what was going on across the floor. I think for me, there seems to be a theme around approachability of the leadership.
Something we could all be better at. How important do you think that is for people who maybe are in business by themselves or with small teams? I mean, what would be the difference there, and how beneficial would that be?
I think one of the things I learned the hard way from being in my own business is around the importance of networks and having conversations with people who aren't necessarily in your organization. I remember when I first started working for myself, because I'm naturally an introvert anyway, it's quite easy for me to hole up in my office and beaver away and not sort of raise my head for weeks. It's my natural inclination. And so, but what I discovered was that I was missing out on the water cooler talk. I was starting to feel a little bit lonely because the conversations I was having was conversations with patients or with clients. It was conversations where I couldn't really be like, so what did you do last Saturday? That sort of thing. So I really missed that connection that you get from being in the workplace. And so if anything, that was the biggest lesson for me. I actually have to actively go out and find opportunities to have those conversations.
Yeah, I can honestly say the same thing as for someone who would regularly be having often quite inappropriately intimate chats at work with people in the airlines who seem to just open up about everything, and also think that the galley curtains are soundproof. But to coming and working for myself and not really having those moments, or not really having that little community where you can chat like that, had to create it for myself, and thankfully have done that, because we otherwise do get a bit too isolated and insulated. And I think if we've learned one thing through COVID, is that we suffer when we spend too much time on our own.
Absolutely. The other thing that's really made a difference for me is using masterminds, and just having someone I can bounce off and say, hey, I'm thinking about this, what do you think? Or have you tried to do something like that? And it just helps to speed up that evolution process, because in the workforce you can go to the guy down the corridor and say, hey, what do you think about this? Whereas when you're in your own business, it's more difficult.
I would second that as well. I'm actually meeting with my mastermind group later today, and it's been one of the best things I've ever done or ever had, and to an extent where I'm like, why did I never do this sooner? And also masterminding with a really phenomenal group of people. It matters who you mastermind with, right? But it's good that we're not all doing the same thing, but we all have similar objectives, and we all get we've created that safe space that we were talking about a bit earlier, of like, we can be vulnerable, we can say what's really going on. We're not having to project out an image of, I am the biggest business success or anything like that. So I can say, actually, this is not going so well, and not be judged negatively because I'm having that issue as well, or I'm having that issue too. And I think, all right, this isn't just me then. That stuff is so important.
It feels better when you've got 2 or 3 people going, oh yeah.
It does. I know I've joined a few business networks for that very thing before. Is I'm trying to be a bit more strategic about some of my business networking these days. But it does make a difference having. You need to have some at least one person who you can ring up and maybe just chew the cud with, or just unload everything with, or all those kinds of things. It makes a big difference. When it comes to influence as a service, what are the things that you see as being most influential, and what are the things that we should be focused on the most if we want to be more influential and therefore persuasive?
I think this one wasn't a natural thing for me, being an introvert, but it's the importance of the network. So like when you're in an organization, it's important to get to know everyone. It's important to get to know what matters most to them. Because again, when you're wanting to persuade someone, you can't really go up to someone that you haven't spoken to for a year and try and talk them into doing something. Persuasion comes from hanging out with them for a year, understanding what matters most to them. And then, being that influential pivot point, if you like, but also finding a way to make things work for them as well as what works for you. Because influence isn't about me getting what I want. Influence is about us both winning. So I would say that the biggest thing is the fact that everyone's watching. You never know when you're making a difference to somebody's life, even if it's just one tiny small thing in a coffee shop. It's always about helping people to feel seen, helping them to feel heard, helping them to feel understood.
Yeah, and if we can support that in other people, or in general in society, then I think we can go a long way. People often think the small acts don't make much of a difference, but as you say, people being seen. Sometimes seeing somebody giving money to somebody who's living on the streets, or seeing somebody pick up a bit of trash and put it in the bin, that has influence.
Totally.
That shows people that there's caring going on. It shows people that people caring about their environment, caring about the vulnerable. Those sorts of actions have influence, and you might not think that much of it, but they can make a huge impact, and you just never know. I've heard many stories of people who have been at the edge, thinking that they couldn't go on, and then seeing one little act of kindness, or having just some random person smile in their direction, and recognize, hey, actually there is some kindness around, there is some love in the world, and maybe it's not so bad after all.
Living in that world where everybody every day is like, I'll just do one random act of kindness today. What a great world that would be.
I would like to live in that world. It's interesting, Tracy. I was writing a blog article about this at the weekend that I published, and so it's very interesting to be talking about that now. And I was really saying about how we all talk about be part of the solution, but we don't always think about how could I be a bit kinder today, or how could I be a bit more loving in my interaction. And we have to connect with that in ourselves. We have to find that in ourselves, have some love and care for ourselves, and project that out into the world. And I was thinking particularly of like a few people who I've connected with. I did a recent interview with a guy called Mark Asquith, who just a really nice guy, big in the world of podcasting, super nice guy. One of the founders of Captivate FM, which is a podcasting hosting service. And just that very natural to chat to. The rapport was instant and easy. We're both from the north of England. That probably helps a bit as well. And another lady, Janie Ainsworth, who just fantastic woman. Some of these people just have this ability to make you feel comfortable and like you've known them for ages, even if you've just met them. And how much I really like that. So I don't know how good I am at that. It's hard to see yourself. I hope to be good at that. I work on being better at being that person, especially as a podcaster and an interviewer. It's an important skill. But like yourself, I'm pretty introvert, and so I also try and work on being less introverted and push the needle towards more. I think I'm more of an ambivert now, hopefully. But the reality is, you can change these things, and you can make a difference. But it has to matter, and if we think it doesn't matter, or if we think we can just carry on in our own little bubble, then we carry on as we were before and nothing changes. But when you recognize that things can, you start looking for the change, start being that, you will start to see it. We start to see what we're putting out there as well. It's the whole sort of philosophy of perception is projection. And we have to start putting out that stuff into the world, because if we're stuck in victim mentality, or if we think the world's a terrible, crappy place, and it can be, that's if we're focused only on that, we're not seeing the other side of life as well, where things are good. Like, we all, I think probably many of us switch between having complete despair for the future of humanity to feeling like there's hope and there's good people out there, and we probably switch between those a lot depending on what we've been seeing and experiencing. But both of those sides,
and we also one without the other,
and we, right, there's very much that, but also we can get stuck in just focusing on the negative, because that's what our brains are more drawn towards. But the positive side is still there as well. There's always going to be good in the world. Good. Although that's a nice thing to be thinking about. I'm wondering, Tracy, people who may be interested in your coaching program or want to find out a bit more about you, what's going to be the best way?
The best way to find me is by checking out my blog, projectjoyful.com, and my podcast by the same name, Project Joyful.
Always good speaking with other podcasters. Tracy, it's been an absolute pleasure chatting to you today. I've really enjoyed the conversation. If there was, above everything else we've talked about, just one thing you hope people will take away the most from our conversation today, what would you like that?
One thing that I would love for everyone to take away is just to give themselves permission to be gentle with themselves.
I like that. So yeah, give yourself permission to be gentle with yourselves. Tracy, we are going to wrap things up there. Tracy Tutty, thank you so much for coming and being my guest.
It's been a pleasure. It's been lovely talking with you as always, Johnny.
Thanks for tuning in. Hope you've enjoyed the show and that you will do your best to be a little bit kinder to yourself. I also hope that you're really taking away from this what it takes to create psychological safety in working environments and how we as leaders are able to become more ethically and effectively influential and persuasive in those circumstances. Now, if you do want to get hold of even more Podfluence, then do join me and hundreds of others for the Podfluence weekly newsletter so that you can get additional insights and articles on growing your coaching business for the long term. You'll find the links in the show notes. For now, though, wherever you're going, whatever you're doing, have an amazing rest of your day. Go and make great things happen.